March 22nd, 1945. Night was falling over the small German town of Oppenheim, located on the western bank of the Rhine River. The river was the last natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany. Beyond it lay the industrial Ruhr region, the roads to Berlin, the final collapse of Hitler's Third Reich. For months, Allied commanders had been planning how to cross this obstacle. Field Marshal Montgomery had spent weeks preparing Operation Plunder, an elaborate assault involving over 1 million troops, thousands of artillery pieces, airborne drops, and massive logistical support. But on this night, General George Patton stood on the riverbank at Oppenheim with a much simpler plan. No elaborate preparations, no massive artillery bombardments, just assault boats, infantry soldiers, and speed. At 1:00 p.m. on March 22nd, elements of Patton's Third Army began crossing the Rhine in silence. No preparatory artillery fire, no warning, just soldiers paddling across in darkness. By midnight, a bridgehead was established on the eastern bank. By dawn on March 23rd, thousands of American troops were across. Patton had beaten Montgomery to the Rhine by one full day. When news reached Montgomery's headquarters on the morning of March 23rd, his reaction was immediate and furious. According to staff officers present, Montgomery did not shout. He went cold. He considered Patton's crossing a deliberate act of insubordination designed to steal glory from British forces. Montgomery drafted an urgent message to Winston Churchill. The message was blunt. American general has conducted unauthorized operation. Request, you demand his immediate relief. British forces cannot operate alongside commanders who ignore strategic coordination. Winston Churchill received Montgomery's message while preparing to fly to Germany to witness Operation Plunder personally. Churchill had been looking forward to this moment. He had promised Montgomery that the British crossing would be the centerpiece of Allied victory in Europe. A demonstration of British military professionalism. Proof that British forces remained the elite of the Allied coalition. Churchill had invited war correspondents, arranged photographers, written communications celebrating British excellence. Everything was ready, except Patton had crossed first. Churchill faced an impossible choice. Support Montgomery and demand Patton's relief, which would create a massive diplomatic crisis with the Americans, or support Patton and undermine British military prestige. Churchill understood immediately that this was not just about one river crossing. This was about the balance of power within the Allied coalition, about whether British commanders still had the authority to set strategic priorities, about whether American generals would follow British direction or pursue their own objectives. To understand Churchill's dilemma, you need to understand the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery. These two generals represented completely different approaches to warfare. Montgomery believed in careful planning, overwhelming preparation, and minimizing casualties through methodical execution. He spent weeks or months preparing operations. He insisted on numerical and material superiority before attacking. His methods were professional, cautious, and typically successful. But they were slow. Patton believed in speed, aggression, and taking risks. He attacked with whatever forces were available, He improvised solutions when resources were lacking. He valued momentum over preparation. His methods were bold, sometimes reckless, and often spectacularly successful. But they violated every principle of careful military planning that Montgomery held sacred. The two generals despised each other professionally. Montgomery considered Patton an undisciplined cowboy. Patton considered Montgomery an overcautious bureaucrat. Their rivalry had been building throughout the war. In Sicily, in 1943, Patton raced Montgomery to Messina, winning by hours. In France, in 1944, Patton's Third Army advanced faster than any force in modern warfare, while Montgomery's forces moved methodically. After the Battle of the Bulge in early 1945, Patton relieved Bastogne in 72 hours, while Montgomery spent weeks preparing his counteroffensive. Each success by Patton made Montgomery look slower. Each careful victory by Montgomery made Patton look reckless. The tension was constant. By March 1945, Montgomery had secured Eisenhower's agreement that Operation Plunder would be the main Allied effort to cross the Rhine. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would cross at Wesel, north of the Ruhr. Patton's Third Army would cross later at Mainz, 100 miles south. Montgomery would get priority for resources, air support, and publicity. This was the plan Eisenhower approved. This was the strategic framework Montgomery expected everyone to follow. But Patton had other ideas. On March 21st, Patton's forces reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. Patton saw an opportunity. The town was lightly defended. The river at that point was narrower and slower than farther north. His staff had been collecting assault boats and bridging equipment for months in anticipation of a crossing. Patton realized he could cross immediately without elaborate preparation, and he realized he could do it before Montgomery's scheduled crossing on March 24th. Patton did not ask permission. He did not coordinate with Montgomery. He did not inform Eisenhower in advance. He simply ordered his forces to cross on the night of March 22nd. The operation was executed with minimal preparation. No artillery bombardment to avoid alerting German defenders, just infantry in assault boats paddling across in darkness. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. Resistance was light. By morning, the bridgehead was secure. Casualties were minimal, fewer than 30 soldiers. On the morning of March 23rd, Patton called Eisenhower. The conversation was brief. Patton informed Eisenhower that Third Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim the previous night. Bridgehead was secure, minimal casualties. Thought you would want to know. Eisenhower understood immediately that Patton had created a diplomatic crisis. He asked if Patton had coordinated with Montgomery. Patton replied that Montgomery had his own crossing scheduled and he did not want to bother him with details. Eisenhower was furious, but also impressed. Patton had violated protocol but achieved a major success. The crossing at Oppenheim opened a direct route into central Germany. Third Army could now drive deep into enemy territory. From a purely military perspective, it was brilliant. From a political perspective, it was a disaster. Montgomery would be outraged. British commanders would feel betrayed. Churchill would face enormous pressure to demand Patton's dismissal. Montgomery received confirmation of Patton's crossing on the morning of March 23rd. hours before Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. According to multiple witnesses, Montgomery's face turned red. He called Patton's action deliberate sabotage. He told his staff that Patton had violated strategic coordination to satisfy his ego. He immediately drafted the message to Churchill demanding Patton's relief. Montgomery believed command discipline was paramount. If Patton was allowed to ignore strategic direction, the entire Allied command structure would collapse into chaos. Churchill received Montgomery's message at 9:15 a.m. on March 23rd. He was aboard an aircraft preparing to land in Germany to witness Operation Plunder. Churchill read the message 3 times. He understood the impossible position he was in. Montgomery was his chosen general. Churchill had defended Montgomery's methods throughout the war, had given him priority for resources, had championed British military professionalism. But Patton had just crossed Hitler's last barrier with minimal preparation, while Montgomery needed weeks to plan the same operation. Churchill landed in Germany and immediately met with Montgomery privately. According to accounts from staff officers, the conversation was tense. Montgomery insisted that Patton must be relieved, that his insubordination could not stand, that British forces could not operate alongside American commanders who ignored coordination. Churchill listened carefully. Then he asked Montgomery one direct question. If Patton had requested permission to cross at Oppenheim, what would you have said? Montgomery replied that he would have denied permission because it diverted attention from the main effort. Churchill paused before responding. Then he asked Montgomery whether the issue was strategy or pride. Montgomery insisted it was about maintaining command discipline. Churchill responded that it appeared to be about Patton making Montgomery look slow. The words were harsh. Montgomery tried to defend his position. Churchill continued. He said that watching Patton cross the Rhine with boats while Montgomery needed months to plan the same operation forced uncomfortable questions about British military methods. Montgomery argued that American methods were reckless and costly. Churchill responded that American speed was achieving results Britain could no longer match. He pointed out that the war was ending. Germany was collapsing. Every day spent in preparation was another day the Soviets advanced west. Patton understood this. Montgomery did not seem to. Montgomery asked if Churchill was choosing Patton over him. Churchill replied that he was choosing to win the war before the Soviets claimed all of Europe. Montgomery made a final attempt. He argued that if Patton was not disciplined, command authority would mean nothing. Churchill gave a response that has been recorded in multiple accounts. He told Montgomery that Patton should be disciplined, that he violated protocol and made British forces look foolish. But if Churchill demanded Eisenhower fire Patton, the Americans would ask why. And Churchill would have to explain that they were firing their most successful general for succeeding too quickly without British permission. Churchill asked Montgomery if he understood how that would sound. Churchill pointed out brutal facts. Americans were providing 70% of Allied forces, bearing the majority of casualties, funding the entire operation. Their general had just demonstrated he could cross the Rhine in one night with minimal preparation, while Britain needed months and 1 million men to do the same thing. If Churchill demanded Patton's firing, he would be admitting that British pride mattered more than Allied victory. The Americans would never accept that, and Britain no longer had the power to force the issue. The conversation ended without resolution. Operation Plunder began on schedule. Montgomery's forces crossed the Rhine with massive artillery support and airborne drops. The operation was successful, but everyone knew it was no longer the main event. Patton had stolen the glory by crossing first. Churchill returned to his aircraft and drafted a message to Eisenhower. The message declined to support Montgomery's request for Patton's relief. Churchill wrote that Patton's operation, while uncoordinated, was successful and contributed to Allied objectives. No action should be taken. Churchill added a handwritten postscript to Eisenhower. Keep Patton moving. We cannot afford to match his speed, but we cannot afford to lose it either. This private note revealed Churchill's true thinking. He recognized that American operational tempo had surpassed British capabilities. That Patton's methods, however undisciplined, were winning the war faster than Montgomery's careful approach. That Britain was no longer the dominant partner in the Allied coalition. That evening, Churchill met privately with his personal physician, Lord Moran. According to Moran's diary, Churchill looked exhausted. He poured himself whiskey and spoke candidly. He said he had just chosen American results over British pride, that Montgomery would never forgive him, that the British military establishment would be furious. But watching Patton cross the river while Britain prepared its elaborate show made Churchill realize something terrible. Britain was no longer the leading military power in the alliance, had not been for quite some time. Churchill had just been too proud to admit it. Moran asked if Churchill regretted the decision. Churchill's response was immediate. Not for a second. Pride does not win wars. Speed does. Patton understands that. Montgomery does not. If Churchill had to choose between a general who protects British prestige and a general who ends the war faster, he chooses the one who brings soldiers home. Churchill continued. He said Montgomery was right that Patton deserved discipline for insubordination. In a properly run military, Patton would face consequences. But this was not a properly run military. This was a coalition of competing national interests where the side with most resources makes the rules. And that side was no longer Britain. It was America. Churchill admitted he had spent the entire war pretending Britain and America were equal partners. But Patton crossing first forced him to acknowledge the truth. Americans were the senior partner now. They provided the majority of men, material, and leadership. Patton crossed first because American military doctrine had surpassed British methods, not in training or bravery, but in willingness to move faster than caution recommends. That was the future of warfare, and Britain was no longer leading it. The consequences of Churchill's decision rippled through Allied command. Montgomery never forgave Churchill. Their relationship, once warm, became coldly professional. British military leadership felt betrayed. The chiefs of staff sent formal protest to Churchill noting that failure to discipline Patton undermined command authority. Churchill's response was blunt. Would you prefer I demand his relief and watch the Americans ignore me? That would undermine British authority far more than quiet acceptance. But Churchill's decision had strategic implications beyond hurt feelings. By refusing to support Montgomery's demand, Churchill signaled to American commanders that operational success would be rewarded even when it violated protocol. Patton understood this immediately. After learning Churchill declined Montgomery's request, Patton wrote in his diary that the British finally understood this was America's war now. America would finish it their way. Years later, Churchill addressed the Rhine crossings in his memoirs. He wrote that Patton's crossing at Oppenheim demonstrated that modern warfare rewards speed over preparation. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was a masterpiece of careful planning, but Patton's improvised assault achieved the same objective in one night with a fraction of resources. The contrast was instructive and, for those who championed British methods, uncomfortable. In a private letter to Eisenhower in 1953, Churchill was more honest. He wrote that he never regretted refusing to support Montgomery's demand. Patton won the race, helped end the war faster, saved lives by moving so quickly Germans could not organize coherent defense. What Churchill said, when Montgomery demanded Patton be fired, revealed the hardest lesson of coalition warfare. Sometimes you must choose between the general who makes you proud and the general who wins faster. Churchill chose speed, chose results, chose to admit that British military methods had been surpassed by American operational tempo. In making that choice, he acknowledged a truth Britain had been avoiding. The empire that once defined military excellence was no longer setting the standard. It was trying to keep pace.